Hello, welcome once again. Do please feel free to pull up a chair and pour yourself a nice drop of something. You'll find there's a decent Bonaharbin on the shelf there. It tastes a bit like drinking a bonfire, but once your eyes stop watering and your taste buds have burnt off, it's quite delicious. If coffee is more your speed, then Jenkins will be along shortly once he's finished doing whatever he was doing with that shovel in the garden. For those of you that perhaps haven't been here before, we're talking about the Battle of Britain in this series, and I hope you've guessed that from the title and the thing that you've just clicked on. The battle was the largest air battle that the world had ever seen up to that point, and it remains one of the largest battles ever fought in the sky. It ran from the defeat of France in June 1940 until the middle of October, and it was an unmitigated disaster for the Nazis, but it wasn't a great deal of fun for the RAF or the United Kingdom either. Had Britain lost this fight, there is a reasonable chance that Germany would have invaded the UK, and that the US would never have entered the European theatre of conflict. In point of fact, Britain did win, and Germany found itself in a protracted war against the Dominion United Kingdom and Empire forces, and like Napoleon before him, Hitler elected then to attack Russia to try and beat Britain, which makes absolutely no sense to me at all, and had disastrous results on both occasions. What this isn't going to be is a blow-by-blow account of the fighting, more a look at strategy, personality, pilot experiences, and the high-level shape of the battle. This then is part 2, where we will meet the complete cockwombles of the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe and examine what passed for planning in their tiny little brains. I'd call it grand strategy, but it wasn't grand. To recap, for those of you who may not have seen part 1 yet, when we left off last time, we'd got to about the start of July, with the French out of the war, the British Army drying what little kit they had left on the south coast, and everybody in German high command pointing at everybody else and wondering how they were going to actually get the job done to attack. Part of the issue here was the way that the Luftwaffe came into the war at all, so before we discuss the joy of Sea Lion, let's go back a little bit. I am not unaware that for a goodly number of folks in this channel, big clanky boxes made of metal that can't even fly are jolly exciting. It surpasses my understanding, but each to their own. Tanks have big guns and they make a lot of smoke and noise, and if you happen to be the poor bastard stood in front of one in your underpants, I imagine they're pretty dramatic. Of course, I feel that a sensible chap will always seek to fight in the air and be able to land and have a nice cuppa, a nice warm shower and sleep, not in a ditch filled with freezing ice water or in a giant metal coffin. In discussions of air fighting, it is generally a matter of time until some simple soul who likes tanks pops up and says something stupid like, quantity has a quality all of its own. Now, said in reference to, say, Soviet tank production or Soviet infantry or, probably Soviet hat manufacturing, that's absolutely fine. Said in the context of air warfare, it is as intelligent as a potato. Speed is life in air combat, and it's true today, and it was true in 1940, only doubly so. So if what you're churning out is totally crappy and slow, and all you're actually really doing is spaffing money up against the wall, killing your pilots and destroying unit morale to make yourself feel better temporarily. So with that in mind, I have prepared the following beautiful graph. What this shows you is British versus German aircraft manufacturing. Notice this is just British. My American friends can be all smug at this point and say, oh, how cute, because, ye gods, American manufacturing was insane. Nonetheless, the Brits out-manufactured Nazi Germany for almost the entirety of the war. The thing that my beautiful graph doesn't show you is what was being made. Now, you'll note that in the late 1930s until pretty much war broke out, Germany was winning the numbers war. But what that meant was it had produced a lot of older types. Whereas the British, due to starting comparatively late, benefited from having fairly new types in volume as war broke out. Unfortunately, it also meant that the volume figures from 1936 and 37 contained a solid number of fairy battles, which were, and it's really hard to say this any other way, they were just the worst aircraft that's ever been made. I'm not going to go into it here, it's a video all on its own, and we may do it at some point soon, but my god, we probably should have just lined them off the runways and set fire to them, because at least we would have been warm in the winter of 1939-40. The famous Messerschmitt 109 was first made in 1938, and the first Spitfire worth worrying about with a variable pitch prop was made in early 1939. The Hurricane was a bit earlier than both of those, with orders being placed in 1936 and units actually first turning up in 1937. But basically, these three types of aircraft made everything that had been manufactured beforehand obsolete, as Bomber Command was about to discover to its cost. And I repeat that the god of air combat, especially in 1940, was speed. Speed meant height, height meant life. And whilst quantity is important, quality is key. Making lots of shit here doesn't matter so much. If hang on here, I'm going to try and lift this up and shift it. Here we go. Oh God, my back, here we are. Oh. This is a speed line, innit? This shows just how dramatically the top speeds of aircraft had changed. And if you look at the introduction date of the Hurricane back there in 1937 and then compare it to 1940, you can see that the top speeds of aircraft had gone up by about 25% in just 18 months. Now, obviously, you can, if you are a complete moron, do something really fucking stupid to break the old aircraft are crappy mantra here by building a new aircraft, which is also crappy. And if you're completely insane and to go to a totally hypothetical idea, let's say you decide to strap a complicated electrically operated 4-gun turret to the back of a fighter and send that into combat, well, it really doesn't matter how many of them that you have, your planes will be shot down, your expensive pilots will be killed, and your country is likely to surrender. The RAF, being the RAF, didn't get everything right, and so in 1938 they commissioned the Boulton Defiant. Honestly, as someone who loves aeroplanes, this bell end of an aircraft is why I drink. The thinking behind this monstrosity was that one person could do the flying and free up the other person to do the shooting. Now, God forgive me for this comparison, but that is basically what the front seat, back seat setup in a beautiful tornado was all about. So it wasn't totally washed thinking, but the problems began if you really needed to shoot anything in front of you, which was basically how all fighters and indeed are operated. That's a dogfight. And I say begin because, honestly, if you got anywhere near your target, you were doing incredibly well. The Defiant had the same engine as the Hurricane and produced similar power on a machine that was twice as heavy. So it was slow, so unbelievably slow, which meant that it couldn't climb and it couldn't maneuver. Fortunately, the Luftwaffe did the decent thing and shot nearly all of them down in short order on their first engagement, and the units were withdrawn to the north, where they got repurposed as night fighters and could do little trouble to anybody, but certainly kept their crews a little safer. There are people that will go into bat for the Defiant. Those people are idiots. At Defiant to one side, this brutal graph tells you something else too. Britain was pumping out new airframes 50% faster than Germany in the crucial period of the Battle of Britain, and these were almost exclusively modern airframes. If you read accounts of pilots, there's lots of references to got shot down, got back to base, got new plane, went up again. If we can put the tinnitus caused by the clanking of their steel balls to one side, it's interesting to contrast that with the Luftwaffe experience, where often pilots had no machine for days or sometimes even weeks. A lot of this came down to culture, of course. The Luftwaffe's propaganda had spurred the British to think seriously about production capacity pre-war. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, had just got their willies out and started to do the helicopter dance. The British had, by 1938, established a series of shadow factories under Lord Nuffield, who ran Morris Motor Company, the thinking being that if you can make a car, you can probably make a plane. And whilst it didn't work properly until about early 1940, once it did, the impact was immediate and almost doubled production overnight. It would take Germany until late 1943 to bring in people like Opel and Volkswagen, and even then only in a limited capacity. We'll come back and have a look at the man responsible for that change, Lord Beaverbrook, in a bit more detail in another episode. Okay, so I think we've got the basics in place there, but because we're going to need it, for this next part we're going to have a quick talk about structure. Now, I'll treat this very much like I treat my sex life, perfunctory and functional only. Let's deal with the RAF first. It was run by a chap called Sir Charles Portal, and under him he had 3 wings. Bomber Command that did, well, you'll never guess this, they did bombers. Fighter Command under Hugh Dowding that did, you guessed it, fighters. And Coastal Command, which was basically there to upset the Navy and compete with the Fleet Air Arm. Fighter Command then split itself up into groups covering specific bits of the United Kingdom, and we will talk about them as we go through the story. But the key numbers to remember are 10 Group that covered the West Country, 11 Group that covered the South East under Keith Park, and bloody 12 Group that covered the Midlands under Sodding, Lee, Bellend, Mallory. Numbers of squadrons varied in each of the groups. They controlled airfields rather than numbers of aircraft, and this meant that they could be incredibly operationally flexible and allowed the establishment of a fighting reserve in different groups that weren't necessarily on the front line. This is not really how an army might do things. The civilian branch of the RAF, or more accurately, the civilian branch of air fighting that controlled the purse strings, was the Air Ministry. And from May 1940, this also included the Ministry of Aircraft Production, known as MAP, which was run by the aforementioned Beaverbrook. As I said, we will come back to him another day. This, of course, then brings me to the enemy. The next section will not be pretty. I speak no German, I am dyslexic, and most of these names are compound words, and whoever decided on them was clearly high. Much like facing off against an angry bull, then, the trick here, I believe, is to look them squarely in the eyes, show them no fear, and take a run at them. Don't do this with a bull, you will die. My German friends can spend the next few minutes gently chortling to themselves. The Nazi High Command went maximum Nazi and maximum army when it was thinking about design for the Luftwaffe. The biggest unit equivalent to a division was called an Airfleet or a Luftflotten. These were split into Freikorps, or literally flight corps, and then into Geschwader, or groups, which was then subdivided into 3 Gruppen, or wings, and that itself was then subdivided into 3 Staffel, or squadrons. Keep up at the back, there'll be a test in a minute. Fighters, bombers, and heavy fighters were all mixed into these groups and designated to work together, which is fine, except the radios that they were all carrying couldn't talk to one another, but that's a story for another day. Oh, sorry, what, you want me to try and do those? Oh, God, I can do it in German if you want. We'll give it a go. Stand well back, kids. I don't want anybody to get hurt. Right, so a fighter group was a Jägergeschwader, a bomber group was a Kampergeschwader, and, fuck me, right, okay, and the heavy fighter group was the Storrengeschwader, I think. It's the Me-1102 engine heavy fighter, whatever you want. For the battle itself, the Luftwaffe could call on 3 of its Luftflotten. Air Fleet 2 under Albert Kessering, Air Fleet 3 under Hugo Spell, and Air Fleet 5 under Hans-Jürgen Stumpf. The civilian and military in Nazi Germany were intertwined to an almost ridiculous degree, as I'm sure everybody that listens to this is aware. The Air Ministry in Germany, or the, oh God almighty, here we go, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, or RLM, and I only stuttered a bit in the middle there, was run by Göring as Reichsmaster der Luftfahrt, which is so close to Luftfahrt it almost seems cruel to be denied it. Göring was commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe as well, so in theory he had control over both the fighting and the supply side of everything with wings in Nazi Germany. As I say, for people supposedly fixated on engineering and efficiency, they approach building these words like a beaver approaching building a dam on speed. So, with all of that out of the way, what actually was the German plan? On the 19th of July, after nearly a month's delay, Hitler gave what he thought was going to be his killer speech to the Reichstag. He actually placed a moratorium on overflights from the UK from the middle of June so as not to upset the British because, you know, kicking somebody's arse and sending their army packing is normally so conducive to warm feelings of friendship and brotherly love. Whatever, for the 2 weeks leading up to the 19th speech, he'd been actually out of Berlin on retreat, basically cut off from the rest of Nazi high command, which left everyone flapping in the wind a bit. Goebbels was nearly wetting himself with excitement, though. He was revving up the press and telling everybody that would listen, just you wait, this is going to be great, Big Papa H is going to do something amazing and give a peace offer to the Brits that they're going to accept, the war is basically over. However, what Goebbels appears to have forgotten at this point is that his boss is a semi-insane artist from Austria with a boner for killing minorities and gambling on high-risk rolls of the dice. In other words, he had the diplomatic skills of a rhinoceros on coke. It therefore came as little shock to the British, but a profound shock to many Germans when Hitler actually stood up and rambled for 45 minutes without making any concrete peace proposals that anybody hadn't heard before. I've included a link into the transcript for the notes here, and if you are so minded, you can go through it and see if you can spot the flipping peace proposal, because I sure as shit can't. Churchill, when he was asked whether he wanted to respond, simply said, "I am not on speaking terms with Herr Hitler," which is, fair enough. This, like so many things, made Hitler absolutely fucking apoplectically furious, summoning up the usual Nazi cobblers about "it is my indomitable will, the destiny of our people, my iron determination," and all the other pathetic phrases of demagoguery that passed for thought in his mind. He decided he had to attack the UK military, and as a result, on the 25th of July, he lifted the overflight ban. On the 29th, he ordered the OKL to be ready to attack England with 24 hours' notice, and on the 1st of August, he issued Directive 17, which formally began the planning process. Despite having had a month's notice that this was possible, and having positioned his fighters and bombers along the French coast, and having had both the army and the navy shouting at him for a plan, Göring was caught absolutely flat-footed by this turnaround, demonstrating yet again that he was utterly out of his depth. He had not called on his staff, he had not brought them together, he had not coordinated with the OKW, nor with the army, nor with the navy, he had not even set a proper planning window for his own staff. Various vague notes had floated around, and by and large the staffs of various Geschwader appear to have been getting on with some planning, but they couldn't coordinate amongst themselves, not least because they couldn't meet, and they were all operating under different apprehensions. The attacks, therefore, that had been launched through the period of beginning of July, and then, after the moratorium was lifted at the end, were very piecemeal and not very effective. When the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe senior staff were finally brought together at The Hague on the 1st of August, their complete lack of coordination or even shared parameters of thinking were drawn into stark relief. Having just helped execute one of the most daring and innovative operations ever seen in warfare, the OKL now set about coming up with a plan so impossibly shit it's hard to describe. In a nutshell, it came down to float around and find out. Initially, Kessering said that they should attack Gibraltar, which is, now hang on, here we are, let me have a look at my map of England. Okay, well, I can't see it there. What about Northern Europe? It's bound to be, oh, no, it's not there. Oh, there we are, there it is, just south of Spain, of neutral Spain, that's not got any Nazis in it at all, other than Franco. Wow, Okay, that's an amazing idea, Albert. I bet the Kriegsmarine would have been fucking overjoyed to have a go at that one. You know, the Med being infested by the Royal Navy and hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly port. Then Kesselring's own chief of staff piped up and contradicted his boss in front of Goering and said that they should only attack London. Now, they all thought that this sounded like a grand idea until somebody pointed out that all the RAF actually needed to do to survive, and therefore be able to interdict any landings, would be to pull back north of London. Then Goering himself said that they should draw circles around London and attack each lair in turn. They then talked about the numbers of aircraft available for the task. One Beppo Schmidt offered an intelligence briefing, and look, I'm going to use the term intelligence here very, very loosely. What Beppo was basically doing was making shit up on the fly and saying things he thought other people wanted to hear. He estimated that the RAF had in total perhaps 400 to 500 aircraft. He didn't mention fighter command because he didn't know that it existed, and he didn't mention radar because he didn't know that the RAF had it, and he didn't mention the dowding system because not even in his wildest nightmares had it occurred to him that the RAF might have a conceptual framework for fighting an air battle. A lot of this was down to Beppo assuming that the RAF looked a lot like the Luftwaffe, but smaller. Luftwaffe Staffels generally consisted of 9 aircraft, so he just assumed that the RAF had the same. In fact, they typically had 12, and later in the fight they would actually grow to about 20. He assumed that the RAF had no mechanism for fighting an air battle because the Luftwaffe was conceived as an adjunct to the army. It wasn't really supposed to conduct independent operations, so it had no clue how to do this. And he had assumed that there was no radar because pre-war intelligence hadn't found any. They had looked, in fairness, 3 times. Once Chain Home was switched off for maintenance, once Fighter Command saw them coming and deliberately broadcast random signals, and once they did actually manage to detect something, but because the signals didn't look like the ones that the Germans used, they simply didn't think it was radar. So, they then turned to the Luftwaffe's available assets, which I imagine at this point there was a certain amount of shuffling of feet and meaningful silences between Kesselring and Sprell. After some rambling, they admitted that they actually only had about 700 bombers and maybe 600 fighters that they could get into the air. To say that this was a bit of a shock was an understatement. Goering is said to have collapsed into his chair and muttered, "This is my Luftwaffe." He had assumed that numbers he'd been boasting about in propaganda speeches for years, around 4,500, were literally true. He had never checked. Worse, many of his commanders also assumed that they had around 4,500, so these comments from Kesselring and Sprell came as a hell of a shock. This nasty bout of realism dealt with, the company got back to the good old-fashioned Nazi bullshit peddling, and instead of getting the commanders from, say, the Wehrmacht and the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe together to look at targets, to sort out priorities, to allocate logistics, to feed in pilot training, to talk to industry about requirements for replacements, and so on and so on and so on, this group of absolute legends came up with a plan which literally said, we'll send a small raid in first, then a big one mixed in with loaded fighters. And a bit like a coach at your local gym, Goering looked at that and went, "Great job, kid, now give me 3 repetitions," after which he assumed that the RAF would have been removed from the sky. Nice one, lads. I think a reasonable person with a rough understanding of the strategic picture for Germany in July 1940 may have had some additional questions. For example, what do you want to do here? Do you want to destroy the whole of the RAF or just their fighters? Might you, and I'm just throwing this out there, what with Britain being a naval nation, destroy some naval targets? I know this is a crazy idea, but our chaps are going to have to float across to the English coast after all. What if, and we assume that the British don't go on their summer holidays and stop making stuff, but in fact increase their production rates? What do we do about that? Should we know where those factories are? What are we going to hit them with? When are we going to hit them? What does good look like? What happens, God forbid, if it turns out that the RAF pilots are as good as our own? What if they learn how to fight quickly and our experienced pilots get shot down? What are we doing about pilot training to replace them? Have we got replacements lined up within the Staffels? Absolutely none of these questions appears to have been raised, much less answered at that first conference in August. Very few of them would actually get answered in the following months. It was simply assumed that the RAF could be made to come up and fight and that the Luftwaffe would shoot them all down when they did. Piece of piss, go home, lads. It also ignored its own internal logic. I mean, just assuming that Beppo Disaster Zone Schmidt had got his numbers right and that there were only 400 or so planes in the sky and the Luftwaffe had 700 odd, then shooting down the RAF at 1-to-1 would be nowhere near good enough if the Luftwaffe wasn't going to be destroyed in the process. They needed to do it at more like 2-to-1. And somebody competent had actually done some numbers on the German side. Theo Ostokamp of JG 51 did some fairly rudimentary but pretty good modelling. He reckoned that in order to support the beachheads, he'd need to make sure that there were about 150 aircraft overhead at all times. Assuming 3 sorties per aircraft per day, that meant he needed around 900 aircraft available in order to protect the proposed landings. That was, as you may have just spotted there, more aircraft than the Luftwaffe was able to have at the beginning of the fighting. So to hit that goal, he needed to allow for no RAF replacements at all, for Luftwaffe replacements and new aircraft to come on stream at the kind of rate they had been pre-war, and JG51 reckoned that they could lose no more than 10% of any of those new fighters, so about 75. Well, that pushes the kill ratio not from 2 to 1 to 5 to 1 in order to be successful. And it was worse than that even. They only had 5 weeks to do it now. So they'd need to fight a huge air battle every day in which they inflicted massive numbers of kills on their opponent and took almost none themselves. And the RAF needed to get no resupply whatsoever for it to work. And all of that assumed that Beppo the Clown's intelligence brief and his numbers were right, which they weren't. He'd undercalled fighter command by about 40%. The Germans had a key advantage here. They could choose the time and the place and the strength of their attacks, but the plan on the 1st of August ceded the impetus almost entirely to the RAF, which is a great idea if you want to get a lot of your own young men killed, but is generally frowned upon in military circles. On this day, at the start of the battle, just how badly things were about to go for the Germans was very unclear across the channel in RAF High Command, so it is there we will go next time. I hope you've enjoyed this video so far. Apologies for cutting this a little bit short, but I think it's important to try and break it up into something like manageable chunks for both you and for me. If you have enjoyed it, please do feel free to hit the like and subscribe button. I look forward to speaking to you again soon. If you haven't enjoyed it, but you've managed to make it to the end of the video, well then I congratulate and salute you too. Please do take a cookie from the jar. If I've upset and mortally offended your ancestors, then I'm sure that there is no force on earth which could stop you from writing me a wall of text in the comments section, so please feel free to do that. I look forward to ignoring it soon. I will see the rest of you back here to talk about the Dowding system, the British plan, and all the fun and games that was about to ensue for the Germans in the very near future.